Hello! Today I'm returning to Final Fantasy with a look at the delightful curio that is World of Final Fantasy. Now, this is a game that initially flew under the radar for me for a couple of reasons. Firstly, its launch date was in very close proximity to Final Fantasy XV, and at the time all of my anticipation and attention was geared towards that game. And secondly, something I'm inadvertently guilty of is that I don't often realise when non-numerical, spin-off or peripheral Final Fantasy games are released. Not that I'm averse to them, and indeed Final Fantasy Tactics, Kingdom Hearts for example, rank among my favourite games, but for whatever reason I'm much more attentive to the marquee mainline numerical titles, and so games like the Crystal Chronicles or Final Fantasy Type O, and in this case World of Final Fantasy, tend to fly under the radar sometimes. And it was quite simply luck that World of Final Fantasy was given to me as a gift about a year ago, which I'm really grateful for, because this is a game that might otherwise have passed me by, but as I'll discuss in this episode, is something that I really quite enjoyed, and it's a really neat homage to Final Fantasy and a medley of light-hearted humour and popular Japanese genre games that's all kind of combined, and much like Kingdom Hearts all those years ago, really sets it apart and uniquely elevates it within the alternative canon of the Final Fantasy series, I think. So, jumping right in, at first glance you'd be correct in thinking that World of Final Fantasy is slightly more light-hearted in nature than your mainline Final Fantasy title, and I'd certainly agree that it's pitched at being inclusive of a younger demographic, but not necessarily exclusive to them. And much like Pixar movies, for example, where the target audiences are generally younger, but there's a lot of nuanced themes and universal humour that hits that adult audience too, World of Final Fantasy also operates with a certain universal appeal, where the story, the art direction and the humour perhaps appeals more to younger audiences, while many of the character cameos and nuances of the more advanced gameplay are befitting of a veteran JRPG audience, and it goes about striking this balance in numerous ways, with one such example being the ability to switch between the classic turn-based combat menu on the battle screen or using a very simple single key press sort of battle menu, which shortcuts can be assigned to and so on. And I think there are some pros and cons to that I'll get to shortly. But just to conclude on the pitching of the game, because I think this is essential to the entire tone and aesthetic of World of Final Fantasy, I did wonder if Shinji Hashimoto, who conceived of and produced the title, figured that those who were, let's say, late adolescents during that golden age run of Final Fantasy 6 through to 10 might reasonably be parents now, and so by releasing a title that would universally appeal to both them and their children was part of the pitch and the proposal of this game. Because it's prudent to note, actually, that Hashimoto also presided over the Disney Final Fantasy crossover of Kingdom Hearts as well, so he's very familiar and close to this sort of universal vibe and this blending of demographics. And actually I think it was him that was in that now legendary elevator conversation to the Disney executives, which planted the seed for the Kingdom Hearts series. But moving on now, and focusing on how this light-hearted universal tone, and indeed the Final Fantasy characters, were implemented to the game, it's worth touching on the art direction and the medley of Japanese styles that were brought to bear on the game, and where Tetsuya Nomura's art direction for Kingdom Hearts swayed quite heavily towards the Disney aesthetic in how it rendered our Final Fantasy heroes. World of Final Fantasy changed tact and opted for a chibi-style rendering of its characters and our Final Fantasy heroes, which really effectively, I think, lifted them out of their known settings and their known worlds into this standalone alternative universe. And I know that chibi design isn't for everyone. It's not something I'm particularly familiar with. I've only seen it in a couple of animes as like an exaggerated reaction. But this cutesy, quintessentially Japanese style really helped to set the scene for the unique world of Grymoire. It created a fun juxtaposition between the characters and their source material, and most particularly, I think, severe characters like Cloud and Squall, who retained their serious personalities and characteristics, but were impossible to take too seriously in this short, rosy-cheeked fashion. So it was a great means of detaching these characters from their worlds and from our existing expectations of them, and planting them in this alternative universe, I think. But notably, I would also say that the design of the two main protagonists, of Lan and Rain, and portraying them as more human proportioned characters, I think this was a good move too, because it enabled a more relatable player window and agency into the events of the game, rather than having the whole thing orientate around these little chibi characters. Further to the chibi design, one thing I hadn't expected, and was one of my favourite recurring features of the game, was that rather than cutting-edge CGI or FMVs dictating the cutscenes, which is part and parcel of Final Fantasy, there were several cinematics in the game that were rendered in traditional anime that actually were met with mixed reception by a few fans, but I felt they were a really pleasant throwback to the Dragon Ball OVA style animes of the late 1990s, and they were almost exclusively cutscenes that dealt in comedy rather than anything overtly dramatic, at least prior to the closing chapters and the final acts of the game, which is where everything took a turn for the worse. But I think the tone and the lightheartedness was really delivered well through these animations and the unique artistic mediums that are quite contrary to the increasing pursuit of realistic animation in most modern Final Fantasy games. And finally, just to wrap up generally on the breadth of the multidisciplinary design here, the realistic versions of Lan and Rain were designed by the Old Faithful, Tetsuya Nomura, while the sprawling bestiary of Final Fantasy creatures and settings were reimagined by contributions from numerous guest illustrators and manga artists. And so I think each of these creators' work combined and harmonised to create a really nice, light-hearted aesthetic, threaded together by the direction of director Hiroki Chiba. So, stepping beyond aesthetics now, and looking into the setting, the characters and the story, the world of Grymoire is somewhat surreal. It's an alternative universe comprised of not only key Final Fantasy characters, but also key Final Fantasy locations lifted from the source material and redesigned into an abstract, unlikely topography which meshes the world's towns and cities together in strange and improbable ways. And for example, we have Final Fantasy VI's Castle Figaro, but it features a dungeon that resembles Final Fantasy VIII's D-District Prison, which itself leads into a Mako reactor. And we have Final Fantasy V's Big Bridge living adjacent to Final Fantasy VII's Train Graveyard, and so on. So this, much like the art style, helps create something uniquely its own, a literal world of Final Fantasy within the game that has this cross-series lore and culture that sees Final Fantasy IX's Vivi appear in Mako reactors, or Final Fantasy IV's Rydia hanging out with Tifa in Nibelheim. And so it's a complete abstraction and reset for these characters in a very self-contained, isolated setting. Alongside the existing Final Fantasy characters and locations, we have areas, elements and characters that are specific to the world of Grymoire and that are the backbone of the story, propelling things forward both narratively and mechanically. So Ninewood Hills, for example, is a central hub of the story. It's the illusory start point for our adventure. Likewise, the main ways of traversing the realms are the Shimmering Gates, which, like the Keyblades in Kingdom Hearts, are another standalone entry to World of Final Fantasy. And coming finally to the heroes and villains, and I suppose the classes of characters in World of Final Fantasy, we have Lan and Rain, who are known as giants in this realm. We have the Lillikins, which are the small chibi characters, and we have the Mirages, which are the beasts that roam the world and service the combat aspect of the game, which I'll come to once we get into gameplay. And finally, beyond this, we have the central foil, the obstacles, which are our antagonists, known as the X9 Knights, comprised of the Masked Woman, the Plumed Knight Pellinor, the Golden Mask Guy, and the central villain, which is Brandilis, who, as with the Mirages, I think were very well designed because they create this plausible cartoony villainy that wouldn't be off-putting or scary to a small child, but still a very cool aesthetic and quintessentially Final Fantasy or fantastical aesthetic that I think adults would be into as well. However, what I will say on the note of villains, and I suppose touching on the structure of the story here, is that through the game, the pacing, the light tone, the comedic reprieves, it's all written really well. And actually it plays out very much like the Final Fantasy games we know and love, where the broad arc takes us to new towns with their own scenarios and side quests, and then the mischievous villains sort of loom over the events, kind of dipping in, propelling our interest and so on. But what I would say is that the final third of the game, from about the Crystal Pillar dungeon onwards, which is a true grind, it does start getting a bit darker and a bit more convoluted, and I suppose a bit more Kingdom Hearts, where we transition from this light-hearted, untaxing sort of game experience to stuff that straddles ideas around alternative timelines and prophecies and reveals around these central villains, which throws the game in an unexpected direction, which isn't unlike other Final Fantasies. But again, for veteran Final Fantasy fans, this would be part and parcel of what you'd want from this game experience. But for children, I think this would get a bit wacky for them, much like Kingdom Hearts 2, for example. And actually, another novelty of the game, I suppose, that isn't part and parcel with previous Final Fantasy games, is that there is a post-game content and multiple endings available that range from the light-hearted to slightly darker in nature. So quite interesting how these twists and turns occur in the final third of the game. But beyond the broad arc of what is, for all intents and purposes, a touching coming-of-age fantasy story that is not unlike renowned anime such as The Cat Returns, The Girl Who Leapt Through Time, and perhaps most similar, I think, in nature, Studio Ghibli's Spirited Away, what really won the game experience over for me was the use of comedy and how comedy primarily drove characterization and narrative progression in key parts of the early game. And I can't understate this, but Final Fantasy fans will know the series has a penchant for goofiness, even with the most severe stories. And so whether it's dialogue-driven or comic relief characters, or even serious characters that are made to do stupid things, like Cloud Strife being made to wear a dress to infiltrate Don Corneo's mansion, for example. World of Final Fantasy draws heavily on this heritage of goofy slapstick humour, and our hero Lan is posited as a slightly dim-witted individual and a recurring source of comedy, and our other hero Rain having her moments of amusement too, by constantly rebuking her brother, but also having an enduring vendetta against the Cactuar. So these were great characterizations to follow through this adventure, and the Final Fantasy characters we met along the way, such as Eiko, Tidus, Gilgamesh, and so on, served as great points of comedy as well, in their own particular scenarios and side quests. So, moving on, I won't labour on the intricacies of story too much, because this has been played by comparatively less people, and there are a lot of twists and turns and reveals that I think it would be interesting to discover firsthand. Because despite the chibi design that maybe makes it seem a little divorced from the series, it does have all of the hallmarks and touchpoints of a good Final Fantasy game. It's one that you don't need to take too seriously, or even invest too much time in, because it doesn't go past the 25-hour mark. But I would stress that World of Final Fantasy, rather than a flaky spin-off or a play on the Final Fantasy brand, it has definitely been made with heart. It has a really nice story, and it stands out on its own unique merits. But moving on, I do want to move into gameplay now, and while World of Final Fantasy does do a great job of delivering this narrative, as I say, and a solid story, the mechanics of combat and progression is the really novel factor of this game, and it's not something that we've seen in any Final Fantasy before. But having said that, it is a very much familiar gameplay system for those familiar with other Japanese RPG titles, particularly the monster collecting ones, such as Ni no Kuni, Jade Cocoon, Digimon, and most famously Pokemon, in the way it encourages you to capture, train, and battle creatures that you find across the world. And I suppose it's not a million miles away from the acquisition of summons that we see in other Final Fantasy games, such as Final Fantasies 8, 10, and 15, where you obtain them through combat, and in the process of doing so, as I say, very similar to the gameplay of classic Pokemons and stuff like that. And on this note, I have previously made an episode talking about the history of summons and why Final Fantasy games and Pokemon games indulge this common capturing and training of beasts so much. And I'd previously suggested that maybe it's an adherence and this rootedness in Shintoism and animism in the culture of Japan. But actually, I was chatting to a friend who was a school teacher in Japan, and he said there is a culture among a lot of kids historically around insect fighting, and they used to kind of collect beetles and make them fight. So actually I think a lot of this kind of monster collecting sort of genre emerges out of that sort of cultural phenomena. But in keeping with the gameplay and this mechanic, the capturing, collecting and upgrading of mirages was a really rewarding and novel device. And you start out, for example, with a really cute little level 1 version of known Final Fantasy monsters, such as a baby behemoth, or a baby Ifrit, or a Chocobo, and then you evolve these through various versions of mid-range and then top-tier sort of monsters, which is a really cool thing to unlock and achieve as you play through. Beyond the huge range of familiar monsters to capture, from Tonberries to Ahriman or Ruby Dragons, there's additional customization and strategy added to the compact gameplay, with the unique stacking system, And this idea emerged from the director Chiba being shown a doodled concept art of chibi Final Fantasy characters being stacked on top of one another, which not only informed the art style of the game, but also the mechanical attributes of battle. And so, rather than other monster collector games, such as Pokemon, where you would summon one Pokemon to appear on your behalf in battle, essentially what we have here is the various monsters categorized as either small, medium, or large in size, and your party is comprised of 2 stacks of a small, medium, or large monster stacked on top of one another, and it combines their strengths and weaknesses and attributes into one solid, playable component. So, for example, a baby behemoth or Chocobo is a small class of Mirage, and that can sit on the top of the stack, while the Ruby Dragon, which is a large Mirage, sits at the bottom of the stack. But once we evolve the baby moth to a behemoth, then it's recategorized as large, and so on. So there's this system of gameplay at work. So a very cool system that really created a unique and customizable gameplay system and party potential around this nucleus of exploration and acquisition that dictates the leveling and the combat. Now, I mentioned the button configurations and menu mapping, and while on the whole I found this an enjoyable and intuitive game, I think in trying to strike the balance between young and older audiences, Final Fantasy veterans and first-timers, the developers unnecessarily convoluted the gameplay, particularly in combat. And what I mean by that is, by default, a player has a single button push menu, where triangle will attack, circle will attempt to capture an enemy, so on. But by pressing, I think it's one of the shoulder buttons, the input menu will switch to the classic Final Fantasy UI, which is the blue bar and scrolling through your different abilities. And it's not the worst thing in the world, but I would prefer it if you could permanently set in the options what sort of battle UI you'd prefer, because to switch this method of input, it's not only once per battle, but it's actually every turn you need to switch to the classic UI if you want to use it. So a little bit cumbersome, and I just say that as someone that prefers that traditional UI and would like it permanently rather than switching constantly. However, on the plus side, some of the great additions to battle and cutscenes as well is the ability to, for example, speed them up by holding the R1 button. So rather than this arbitrary decision between skipping a cutscene or sitting through a cutscene, you can actually zoom through them so you can pick up the gist of the story, or in battle, again, you don't have to sit through these lengthy kind of attacks or anything. You can fast forward it. So really good thing to introduce. So moving on, around the core mechanics of combat, we have the exploration and exposition that one would expect from a Final Fantasy game, with each scenario offering different unique elements of puzzling and narrative progression that builds to a crescendo of dungeon crawls and wacky mini-games once we reach the final acts of the game. And while most of them are pretty enjoyable, and their secret locations and unlockable summons and mirages and various things to obtain and discover, one or two of the mini-games are just terrible. There's one that requires you to catch a cactuar in a whack-a-mole style, and it's pretty much a game of chance rather than warranting any discernible skill. It's really frustrating, and it doesn't make it obvious that you can skip this minigame when you first start it. So it was really frustrating for me because I was sitting through it before really realising that it wasn't a prerequisite to continue the story. So definitely some pros and cons around the minigames there, but most of them are skippable if you don't enjoy that sort of thing. So that about covers the gameplay in brief, and to summarise, the monster capture gameplay and the stacking system is a really cool and novel means of engaging and propelling the player forward through the game. And while the game is only around 25 hours, you can spend much longer in World of Final Fantasy if you choose to collect all the mirages, level them all up, and really engage and play around with that sort of gameplay. Finally, I'd just like to touch on the music for this game, because, again, it can't be understated just how good the team of composers are at Square. And while the series rightly owes a lot to Nobuo Uematsu, whose name is synonymous with the scores of Final Fantasy, the team that have taken up the gauntlet to maintain the quality and the atmosphere and the unique attributes of the Final Fantasy scores have really delivered across these different entries. And whether it's Masayoshi Soken and his work on Final Fantasy XIV, whether it's Yoko Shimomura and her work on 15, and turning to World of Final Fantasy, we have perhaps the closest protege to emerge out of the Uematsu era, which is Masashi Hamauzu. And indeed, not only was he hand-picked and employed by Uematsu back in the late 90s, but he is one of the composers, or the co-composers I should say, on the eclectic and immortal score of Final Fantasy X, and later he was the main composer on Final Fantasy XIII. And I think his balance and nuance between electronic ambience and classic fantasy can really be felt in the score of World of Final Fantasy II. So a massive fan of the music here, and if you're interested in my discussions on Final Fantasy composers and the legacy of the music in this series, I'll drop a link to that episode. So that about wraps up my thoughts on World of Final Fantasy, a game that I'm immensely glad that I discovered quite belatedly after its release, but one that, while it does masquerade as a cute, chibi, kid sort of game, it has all of the hallmarks of a great RPG, JRPG, and is a welcome spin-off, operating on the fringes of the mainline Final Fantasy series. If you got this far, thanks very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And feel free to drop a comment below, let me know your thoughts on Final Fantasy, and if you haven't already, please consider sharing, subscribing, which will keep you updated with my latest posts.